The lecture on debtors reconciliation covers the preparation of the account receivable subsidiary ledgers. Prior to this lesson, you have prepared transactions into the subsidiary journals for credit transaction. You've also closed off the subsidiary journals and you've drawn up the control accounts and properly closing them off in the general ledger. Let's look at the process of capturing transactions affecting accounts receivable in both the subsidiary journals and the control accounts in the general ledger. By analyzing the source documents showing the daily recordings into the personal accounts of clients and the month-end posting into the account receivable control in the general ledger. Starting with the duplicate invoice for credit sales, these on a daily basis will be recorded in the account receivable journal and immediately debited to the subsidiary ledgers of clients. For the duplicate credit note for returns, these will be recorded on a daily basis to the account receivable allowances journal and immediately credited to the account receivable subsidiary ledgers. The duplicate receipts for debtors payments, they will be recorded in the cash receipt journal and immediately credited to the account receivable in the subsidiary ledgers. Duplicate receipts for discount allowed on debtors payments, the entries will be recorded in the cash receipt journal and also credited to the accounts receivable of the subsidiary ledgers. The bank statement for RD checks and paid checks by the bank, these will be recorded in the cash payment journal and immediately be debited in the accounts receivable in the subsidiary ledgers. Journal voucher for discount withdrawn on the RD check, this will be recorded in the general journal and immediately be debited to the accounts receivable in the subsidiary ledgers. Journal voucher for credit losses being bad debts written off, they will be recorded in the general journal and immediately be credited to the accounts receivable in the subsidiary ledgers. Journal voucher for interest on overdue account of debtors, this will be recorded in the general journal and immediately be debited to the accounts receivable in the subsidiary ledger. At the end of the month, the subsidiary journals were closed off and posted to the accounts receivable control in the general ledger as follows. The total sales were recorded on the debit side of the control account posted from the accounts receivable journal. Total returns were credited to the control account in the general ledger posted from the accounts receivable allowances journal. The account receivable control in the ledger was credited with the contra bank posted from the cash receipt journal as debtors payment. The accounts receivable control in the ledger was credited with the discount allowed posted from the cash receipt journal being the discount that was allowed on the debtors payment. The accounts receivable control in the general ledger was debited with the bank from the cash payment journal, being the unpaid check returned by the bank. The accounts receivable control was debited with a discount allowed, posted from the general journal, being the discount withdrawn on the RD check. The accounts receivable control in the ledger was credited with credit losses posted from the general journal, being the bad debt written off. Lastly, the account receivable control in the general ledger was debited with interest received posted from the general journal, being the interest on overdue account. In the past, we prepared the accounts receivable journal and posted the totals of columns to various accounts in the general ledger. And the column for accounts receivable was posted to the accounts receivable control in the general ledger. We've also prepared the accounts receivable allowances journal, and the accounts receivable column was posted in the accounts receivable control in the general ledger. In the cash receipt journal, the column for the accounts receivable was posted in the general ledger. In the cash payment journal, at the end of the month, an RD check was recorded. This RD check was also posted to the accounts receivable control in the general ledger. At the end of the month, the accounts receivable control in the general ledger will show the following entries. On the debit side, the opening balance brought down from the previous period, the total sales for the month posted from the accounts receivable journal. On the credit side, it will show the total returns posted from the accounts receivable allowances journal. It will also, on the credit side, show the entries posted from the bank cash receipt journal. On the debit side, it will show entries posted from the cash payment journal. At the end of the month, the account was closed off by calculating the closing balance, which will represent the opening balance in the new month. And the closing balance was calculated as 8,828 rands. Previously, we recorded the source document into subsidiary journals and then posted totals into the general ledger. With the next slides, we will be recording source documents into the subsidiary ledgers, starting with the accounts receivable journal, where we recorded invoices that were issued to clients. These invoices, on the day that they were issued, should also be recorded in the subsidiary ledgers. Starting with B. Brown, we will open up the accounts receivable subsidiary ledger for him with the following columns: the date, the details, the debit column for entries that increase his account, credit column for entries that will reduce his balance, and the balance column for showing daily balances and month-end balance. If B. Brown had a balance owing from the previous month, this balance will be shown at the beginning of the month as the balance brought down, and the amount that you owed will be shown under the balance column. In this case, the amount that you owed was 1,200. Then on day 5, when the invoice was issued, under the details, the invoice number will be reflected. In the debit column, the total amount of the invoice, including VAT, will be reflected. Then a new balance under the balance column will be calculated, and the balance that you owed is now 8,350 rands. The same account will be opened for Eswart in the account Receivable Subsidiary ledger under the date the invoice was issued, which is the 5th. Details: invoice number 113. Debit: the total amount of the invoice including VAT 2,500. The balance that he owes under the balance column 2,500. In the cash receipt journal, a receipt was issued on the 7th to B. Brown. Under the accounts receivable column, the amount that he was settling was an amount of 1,200. And on this settlement, a discount was allowed to him. Note that when you have an entry under the accounts receivable column, to also disclose the name of the client in the details column so that the entry can be recorded in the correct subsidiary ledger. Therefore, we will go to B. Brown's account. On the 7th, show the receipt 24. The credit side, show the amount that was being settled. In this case, 1,200. Under the balance column, calculate the new balance that is owing, which is now 7,150 rand. In the accounts receivable allowances journal, we issued a credit note on the 9th to B. Brown. Under accounts receivable, the total amount was 150. We will go to the account of B. Brown. On the 9th, reflect the credit note for goods returned, credit note number 005. The amount of the returns on the credit side, 150. Calculate the new balance and show it under the balance column as 7,000. Again, in the cash receipt journal, we issued a receipt on the 12th to S. Swart. Under the accounts receivable, the amount that he was settling is 2,300. Into his account S. Swart, on the 12th, we will reflect the receipt which was issued, receipt 25. In the credit column, the amount that was being settled, 2,300. New balance under the balance column is calculated as 200 rand. In the cash payment journal, at the end of the month, there's an entry that was recorded from the bank statement. And the details of the entry is B. Brown, RD. It means this is an unpaid check that has been received from the bank. In the bank column, the total amount, 1,128 rand. Under sundries, it shows that this entry will affect the accounts receivable. In the accounts receivable for B. Brown, the entry will be recorded at the end of the month. The details of the entry will be the bank statement number 3103. Because it's a RD check, it will be reversed on the debit side, and the entry will be 1,128 rand. And the new balance under the balance column will be calculated as 8,278 rand. Note that this RD check affects the transaction that was made on the 7th. On the 7th, he was paying us in full settlement of 1,200, and we allowed him the discount. Therefore, the 1,128 rand RD check does not include the discount allowed. We will therefore have to prepare a general journal to withdraw and reverse the discount that was allowed when he made a payment on the 7th. At the end of the month, after adjusting entries have been captured, the General Journal under the details reflects that the accounts receivable control in the General Ledger, as well as B. Brown's account, should be debited with an amount of 72 rand. The contra entry to this amount will be the discount allowed account, which must be credited with an amount of 62 rand 61 cents, and the SARS VAT account, which should be credited with an amount of 9 rand 39 cents. Narration reading as discount withdrawn on unpaid check. The second adjusting entry is to debit the accounts receivable control in the General Ledger, as well as B. Brown account with an amount of 55 rand, and the contra entry to be credited to interest received account with an amount of 55 rand. The narration reading as interest charged on overdue account. Note that the interest charged is exempt from VAT. Both of these adjustment entries will affect the General Ledger and the Subsidiary ledgers. In the Subsidiary ledger for B. Brown, at the end of the month, under the details, we will reflect the journal voucher, and the amount will be debited as 72 rand, representing the discount that must be reversed on an RD check. The total balance owing, it's now 8,350. Note that this journal voucher and the entry that was made earlier from the bank statement reflects the fact that the settlement amount of 1,200 that was made earlier has now been reversed in B. Brown's account. The last journal is journal number 8 for interest charged, which should be debited in his account, and the new calculated balance in his account is 8,405 rands. This is the reflection of the accounts receivable control in the General Ledger after the account has been closed off at the end of the month. The follower columns shows the various subsidiary journals from where the entries were posted. On the other hand, the details of the subsidiary ledgers shows the source documents from where entries were generated. Both of these recordings were initiated from the same source documents. Therefore, the closing balance of the general ledger and the subsidiary ledgers added together should be the same. Looking at the control account in the general ledger, the closing balance was calculated as 8,028 rands. In the subsidiary ledgers, the two closing balance added together, that is the balance for B. Brown and the balance for S. Swart, gives a total closing balance of 8,505 rand. Both of these balances are not the same. We therefore have to investigate the difference. The following were errors and omissions that were discovered. The interest charged of 55 rand was omitted in the control account. The discount on the RD check was not entered in the control account. Number 3, the total sales were understated by 300 rand. Number 4, the invoice 113 of 2,500 was erroneously entered as 2,000 400. The last error, the returns of 150 rand were omitted in the list. You are required to rewrite the accounts receivable control in the general ledger and to show the reconciliation of the adjusted control account with the account receivable or the debtors list. In the general ledger, the control account that must be rewritten is the account where the closing balance was calculated as 8,028 rands. For the account receivable or the debtors reconciliation statement at the end of March, the following columns must be shown: the details as well as the debit and the credit columns. At this stage, you should have familiarized yourself with the type of entries that are recorded in the accounts receivables. The first entry that must always be recorded in the reconciliation statement is the closing balance as calculated from the subsidiary ledgers. In this example, we calculated the closing balance from subsidiary ledgers as 8,505 rands. After this, the errors and omissions can be brought into the books. The first entry being the interest charged of 55 rand, which was omitted in the control account. The error is in the general ledger. Therefore, in the account receivable control, we will show on the debit side the details of interest received, posted from the general journal, the amount 55 rand. In the second transaction, an invoice 113 of 2,500 was erroneously entered as 2,400 in the list. The error was committed in the subsidiary ledgers. Therefore, the correction will be made on the reconciliation statement. The entry will be shown as invoice 113 understated, the amount 100 rand. The invoice is debited on the statement because it increases the receivables. The third entry, the discount on the RD check of 72 rand was not entered in the control account. The error is in the general ledger. Therefore, on the debit side of the general ledger, we show the discount that must be reversed, posted from the general journal, amount 72 rand including VAT. Line transaction 4, the total sales were understated by 300 rand. Total sales are normally recorded in the general ledger. We therefore go to the debit side of the accounts receivable control, show the entry as total sales, posted from the accounts receivable journal, the total amount 9,650. The last transaction, it's line 5. The returns of 150 were omitted in the list. The error was committed in the subsidiary ledgers. Therefore, the correction will be done on the reconciliation statement. Returns will be reflected as credit note, omitted. On the credit side, 150. When all the errors and omission have been brought into books, the final step will be to close the accounts receivable control in the general ledger by balancing it off with the adjusted totals The total calculated after the adjustment is 12,105, giving a balancing figure representing the closing balance of 8,455, which will be the opening balance in the new month of 800,455 rands. The last step will be to balance off the reconciliation statement. We will calculate the highest total, carry it over to the opposite side, calculate the missing figure, calculated as 8,455, which is the same closing balance that was calculated from the accounts receivable control account in the general ledger. This slide presents a different scenario for the requirement. Here, you are required to show the reconciliation of the control account with the account receivable or the debtors ledger. You are not required to show or to rewrite the accounts receivable control in the general ledger. For the account receivable or the debtors reconciliation statement at the end of March, the following columns will be shown. The details, the column for the subsidiary ledger entries, and the column for the account receivable control entries. The entries that increases the ledgers will be positive, and the entries that reduces the ledgers will be negative. The first entries to be recorded will be the closing balances calculated from these ledgers before this reconciliation. The closing balance that we calculated from the subsidiary journals was a total of 8,505 rand. For the account receivable control in the general ledger, the closing balance was 8,028 rands. Bringing in the errors and omissions, the first entry being the interest charged of 55 rand, which was omitted in the control account. The entry will be shown under details as interest received. In the accounts receivable control column, it will be reflected as 55. The next line, number 2, invoice 113 of 2,500 was erroneously entered as 2,400 in the list. On the reconciliation, it will be shown as invoice 113 understated. The entry affected the subsidiary ledger, therefore it will be shown in the column for the subsidiary ledger, the understated amount 100 rand. Line number 3, the discount on the RD check was not entered in the control account. On the reconciliation, it will be shown as discount allowed. In the column for accounts receivable control, it will be recorded as 72 rand. Line transaction 4, the total sales were understated by 300 rand. On the reconciliation, it will be shown as understated sales. The entry affected the control account. Under the control column, it will be shown as 300 rand. Last transaction number 5, the returns of 150 were omitted in the list. On the reconciliation, it will be shown as credit note omitted. It affected the subsidiary ledgers, therefore, in the column for subsidiary ledgers, it will be shown as a minus 150. Then the reconciliation will be concluded by balancing off the subsidiary ledger with the accounts receivable control column. When we balance them off, they should give us the balancing closing totals. And the total given or calculated is 8,455 Rand on both columns.